On that dark May night in 1951, two men stood on the deck of a ship approaching the French coast. One was Donald Maclean, a top-level diplomat from the British Foreign Office. The other was Guy Burgess, a prestigious officer in MI6. Both were among Britain's most trusted men, or so it seemed. Because that night they were fleeing. Their destination was Moscow, and the chaos they left behind would become British intelligence's worst nightmare. But the most shocking thing was the man who warned them, Kim Philby, MI6's former counterintelligence chief. He was also a Russian spy, and nobody knew. February 1934, Vienna. 22-year-old Harold Adrian Russell Philby stood in the City Hall building. He was holding hands with his new wife Litzy Friedman. As the official wedding ceremony quickly concluded, Philby's heart was racing with excitement. He had just graduated from Cambridge University. He was an idealistic, passionate young man who believed in communism. He had come to Austria to fight against fascism. He met Litzy in the underground resistance. They both burned with the same fire. They believed in the same ideals, but Litzy's activism had put her on the Austrian police's target list. There was only one solution: marriage. As a British citizen, Litzy could escape the country as Philby's wife. As soon as the ceremony ended, the couple immediately set off for England. Philby thought his life's greatest adventure was beginning. But the real adventure was just about to start. A few weeks later, June 1951, Philby was sitting on a bench in London's Regent Park. Litzy had arranged a special meeting for him. She hadn't given details. She only said this man could change his life. Philby was waiting curiously. A middle-aged, curly-haired, stocky man walked toward him. With an Eastern European accent, he introduced himself as Otto. The two immediately fell into deep conversation. Marxist theory, Soviet philosophy, the Nazi threat. Otto was testing Philby's thoughts. He was measuring his commitment to communism. Philby's eyes were sparkling. This man thought like him. He shared the same worldview. Otto asked Philby a dangerous question. Would you put yourself in danger for the cause of peace? Philby didn't hesitate. Yes, he would. He even said he wanted to join the Communist Party. But Otto had a different offer: to become a secret agent, to work for the Soviets, to spy. Philby's heart raced. His fingers were trembling, but his mind was clear. He accepted. Otto would teach him the basics of espionage, leaving secret messages, spotting a tail, recognizing phone-tapping signs. His first mission was simple: identify other communist friends from Cambridge, especially those who might make good agents. Philby shook hands with Otto. The deal was sealed. By summer's end, Philby gave his first name, Donald Maclean. In 1935, Guy Burgess followed. By 1937, Anthony Blunt and John Cairncross had also been recruited by the KGB. The Cambridge Five were born. They were all the cream of Britain's ruling class. Perfect backgrounds, high-level connections, brilliant futures. And now they were all working for the Soviets. But none would rise as high as Kim Philby. None would cause as much damage. Philby wasn't just a spy. He was about to embed himself in the very heart of the system. April 1940. In the elegant tea room of London's St. Erman's Hotel, Philby was preparing for the most important job interview of his life. The woman sitting across from him would be Marjorie Maxey. She was the head of MI6's Section D. She was responsible for covert paramilitary operations. Philby looked calm, but inside he was burning. He had been preparing for this moment for years. He had worked as a war correspondent for the Times newspaper. He had written from Spain, from France. He had carefully built his public image. He had stayed away from left-leaning social circles. He had openly supported conservative politics. He had completely cut contact with Soviet agents, all for this moment. When Maxey arrived, Guy Burgess was with her, Philby's old friend, and also another Soviet spy. Burgess was already working at MI6. He had given a reference for Philby. There was also an MI6 deputy director. He was also an old friend of Philby's father. Two references, two powerful names. The interview was merely a formality. Maxey said Philby was exactly what they were looking for. Philby couldn't believe it. Was it this easy? All those rehearsed answers weren't needed. The right connections, the right background, the right image. That was all. When the interview ended, Philby was an MI6 agent, and the Soviets were now inside British intelligence. 1 year later, 1941, Philby was standing at a train station in London. A briefcase was in his hand. Inside were extremely valuable documents. World War II was in full swing. The Soviet Union was now Britain's ally against Germany. But there was no trust. Officially, some intelligence sharing was done. But many things were still kept secret. Philby was stealing that secret information. He boarded the train. A few stops later, he got off. He boarded another train. He got off again. He changed buses. An hours-long tail evasion routine. Finally, he sat on a bench in a small park. A man came next to him. Philby handed him the briefcase. The man took it and disappeared. What was in the briefcase? Britain's plans to spy on the Soviets. The lies they planned to feed Stalin. Encrypted messages about Nazi Germany's next moves against Russia. And most importantly, a list of everyone working for British intelligence. Their likes, dislikes, weaknesses, all meticulously compiled, copied and delivered by Philby. As the man walked away, Philby left the park with a casual walk. But inside he was elated. He was struggling not to look back. If he was caught, he could be executed for treason. But he wasn't caught that night, and he wouldn't be caught for many more nights. Because Philby wasn't just giving documents, he was also killing people. 1947, autumn, Turkey-Georgia border. Philby was walking in a dark night, in a deserted field. Next to him were two young Georgian exiles. Both were 20 years old. They came from the Georgian exile community in France. Philby had recruited them for a secret operation for MI6 called Operation Climber. Their mission was simple: infiltrate Georgia, establish contact with anti-Soviet rebels, create a secure communication network. This was the first step in MI6's plan to support the freedom struggle in Georgia. If they succeeded, they would be heroes. They would be the ones who saved their country. If they failed, MI6 would cancel all Georgian operations. The young men were nervous but determined. They said they were ready. Philby gave them the final supplies: radios, gold coins, 2 guns. He saluted them. He wished them good luck. The duo crossed the border and headed toward a grove of trees. They were trying to stay in the shadows, but Philby knew it was useless. Soviet forces were waiting for them, because Philby had warned them in advance. Within seconds, gunfire was heard. One of the young men was shot and died instantly. The other avoided being shot, but couldn't escape. Soviet soldiers captured him. Philby knew he would probably be tortured and killed. Philby quietly disappeared into the night. He was already preparing his report. He would tell MI6 how the mission failed. He would appear sad, disappointed, but inwardly, he was celebrating his victory. It was a disaster for British intelligence, a triumph for Moscow, and Philby was the architect of this victory. But someone was watching him, someone he wasn't aware of. That person was a codebreaker, and within a year Philby's world would begin to collapse. Because in America, a man was deciphering Soviet telegrams. 1947, Washington, D.C. In the basement of the Department of Defense, a linguist and codebreaker named Meredith Gardner was sitting in front of piles of paper. He was running the Venona project. This project was trying to decipher Soviet communications. He had been doing this job for years, and for years he had made no progress. Soviet codes were considered unbreakable. Many experts had given up hope. But Gardner hadn't given up. That morning, a cryptanalyst left him a new pile of telegrams. Gardner grumbled and began to examine them. He worked for hours. Then he saw something, a code sequence. He had seen it before. He searched through old telegrams. Yes, it was there. The same code used years ago. Someone in Moscow had made a mistake. They had used the same code twice. This gave Gardner his first real chance. He worked for months. He broke down the code sequence piece by piece, and finally he succeeded. He broke the code. The messages were coming from the KGB, and the recipients were Soviet agents managing spies around the world. Some agents were in America. Gardner immediately rushed to his superiors. He presented his findings. The foundations of Western intelligence were being shaken. The Soviets had a massive espionage network, and this network extended right into the British government. Over the next few years, Gardner deciphered hundreds of Soviet telegrams. 2 code names stood out: Homer and Stanley. Homer was leaking from the British Embassy in the United States in 19... Who Stanley was more unclear, but he was clearly inside the government. Gardner didn't know their real identities yet. But he was getting close, and in 1950, when MI6's new Washington station chief came, Gardner showed him his findings. He told him everything about Homer and Stanley. The visitor listened carefully. He remained calm. He was professional. He asked if he could come back to follow developments. Gardner was impressed. This man was cool-headed. What Gardner didn't know was, the visitor's name was Kim Philby, and he knew very well who Homer was, because Homer was his Cambridge friend Donald McLean. Philby had recruited him. And Stanley was Philby himself. Philby remained calm for a year, but inside, panic was growing. May 1951, Washington, D.C., in a red booth at a Chinese restaurant, Philby was sitting. Guy Burgess came across from him. He was drunk. In the middle of the day, Philby was disturbed. Burgess was becoming increasingly careless, more alcoholic, more dangerous. Philby lowered his voice. He gave bad news. American intelligence had figured out Homer's identity. They had deciphered a message from Homer had a pregnant wife, and she was staying in New York at that time. Only one British embassy official fit this description: Donald McLean. Burgess's face turned pale. McLean had been incredibly valuable during his golden years from 1940. He had leaked secret messages between Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt. He had reported on America's development of the atomic bomb. If McLean was interrogated, he could crack. Then he could give up Burgess and Philby. Burgess pulled out a flask from his pocket. He took a long sip. His hand was trembling. McLean would definitely talk, he said. Then they would all be caught. Philby calmed him down. They had a plan. Soviet agents had already taken action. Tomorrow Burgess would go to England. He would warn McLean. McLean would escape to the Soviet Union. Burgess would then return and continue his routine. A single escape could be contained. But Philby made one final warning. He looked into his eyes. Under no circumstances should Burgess escape with McLean. If both disappeared together, the trail would lead straight to Philby. Moscow's entire network could be exposed. Burgess nodded. He said he understood. Philby wanted to trust him, but the panic in Burgess's eyes worried him. A few days later, June 9, he took out a shovel, a camera, films, and sensitive documents from his bag. All the evidence, all his connections with the Soviets. He started digging the ground. Days had passed since Burgess warned McLean, and Burgess had made a mistake. Exactly the mistake Philby had warned him about. He had panicked, and he had fled to the Soviet Union with McLean. 2 senior agents had disappeared at once. The newspapers had gone crazy. Headlines were everywhere. British spies flee to Russia. British and American intelligence were shocked, and now everyone was asking one question: who warned them? As Philby buried the evidence, he thought about his options. He could flee. Soviet agents could take him to Moscow too. A new identity, a new life. But this meant sacrificing everything. Years of dedication, his belief in the communist cause. Philby still believed in something. Communism was humanity's best path. To flee now would mean wasting all his work. He made his decision. He would stay, whatever comes. He got in the car and drove back to Washington, because the interrogation was beginning, and Philby's life depended on a lie. June 14, 1951, London. Philby entered MI5's interrogation room. He had been summoned from Washington 2 days earlier. He worked for MI6, but MI5 was interrogating the Domestic Security Service. Inside were 2 men, his colleague from MI6, Jack Easton, and MI5 chief Dick White. Easton seemed apologetic. He said he saw Philby as a respected MI6 man. He didn't accuse him. His only fault was trusting Burgess, the charming drunk. But Dick White was far more suspicious. He asked questions about Philby's past, about his first wife, Litzy. Yes, Philby admitted, she was a communist, but Philby had tried hard to change her mind. He himself had never joined the party. About the Georgian border incident. Why were the anti-Soviet rebels killed? Philby stumbled. He stuttered. He had rehearsed for this kind of interrogation for years, but now, under real questions, he was collapsing from stress. White dropped the bombs. MI5 wasn't alone. The CIA also believed Philby was a spy. Washington had sent an ultimatum that morning. Either MI6 fires Philby, or relations with American intelligence end. Philby had denied everything. But he knew one thing: this was over. Days later, MI6 offered a deal: resign quietly, get a generous severance, case closed. Philby accepted. In the summer of 1951, he resigned. The scale of his betrayal was astonishing. As head of the Soviet counterintelligence division, he had protected Moscow's espionage networks, exposed British operations. He had access to the West's most sensitive operations against the Soviets, and he reported everything to Moscow. Still, he was lucky. There was no concrete evidence against him, at least not yet. For the next 10 years, Philby lived like a ghost. He stayed in London for a while, then moved to Beirut as a journalist. He remarried. A more suitable wife. He fixed his image, but he continued spying. Using his position, he gathered intelligence for Moscow. He struggled with money. Then one day, in 1962, a ray of hope. The new MI6 station chief wanted to meet. Maybe they would take him back. Maybe he was forgiven. But the person who opened the door wasn't the station chief. It was Nicholas Elliott, an MI6 officer he had known since and he had new evidence. Elliott knew every one of Philby's lies. The game was over. January 12, 1963, Beirut, Lebanon. Philby climbed up to an apartment. His heart was pounding. Inside, Nicholas Elliott was waiting. Friend of many years, or so he thought. Elliott went straight in. MI5 had gathered new evidence. A woman named Flora Solomon had testified that in the 1930s, Philby had tried to recruit her for the communist cause. Testimonies from a Soviet defector. A fresh examination of Philby's career. Now there was strong evidence that Philby was a Soviet spy, that he was the third man who warned McLean and Burgess in Philby's response was ready, practiced, complete denial. He pretended not to believe it. He asked how Elliott could suspect him. After all these years, Elliott exploded. His anger was real. Philby had betrayed not only his friendship, but his family, his country too. Elliott gave him two options. Confess everything, say what you know, get immunity from prosecution, or keep denying, lose your freedom, have your passport cancelled, your bank account frozen, your life ends. Philby chose carefully. While drinking brandy, he confessed, but only in the night, long before joining MI6. Yes, he had spied for the Soviets, but he was young, idealistic. Then he quit. For the next 4 days, he revealed enough but never the full truth, to appear convincing enough. Elliott pressed him to take the immunity deal, but Philby saw this was a trap, another prison. MI6 would use him to force betrayal of his communist ideals. He would spend the rest of his life under their control. Luck came. Elliott went to Africa, and for unknown reasons, no surveillance was arranged. Philby contacted Soviet agents. They said, on January 23rd, a man will pass by his apartment. If he's holding a book, everything is ready. He can escape immediately. If he's holding a newspaper, they need more time. January 23rd came. Philby sat on his balcony, in the rain. Finally he saw a man, walking down the road. Philby leaned forward. The man was holding a book. Philby ran. He told his wife he'd be back in a few hours for dinner. Instead he got into a waiting car. He went to the port. From there he boarded a ship to Moscow, to his new life. News spread quickly. The escape of MI6's former counterintelligence chief shook British intelligence. Philby, Burgess and McLean had all attended Cambridge. The press called it the Cambridge spy scandal, but there were more secrets. Secrets that would take almost 20 years to emerge. November 15, 1979, London. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher spoke in the House of Commons. She confirmed what a recent newspaper article had exposed. Anthony Blunt, the royal family's art curator and Cambridge graduate, was a Soviet spy. Even more shocking, Blunt had confessed this in exchange for immunity from prosecution. For 15 years, many in the government, including the royal household, had known of his treachery, yet they had allowed him to keep his prestigious position. The British public was horrified. Blunt had not only given sensitive information, but names of British agents to the Soviets, potentially causing their deaths, and the government had covered it up, to avoid embarrassment. Many wondered, what else was the government hiding? In 1981, the answer came. Margaret Thatcher revealed another spy, John Cairncross. He had also been recruited from Cambridge. From his position at the Bletchley Park codebreaking center, he had relayed deciphered German messages to Moscow. He had given the Soviets early warning about Nazi military operations. Like Blunt, his role as a double agent had been hidden from the public for 15 years, to avoid embarrassing the government. In the end, consequences caught up with all of the Cambridge 5 spies, in one way or another. After Kim Philby arrived in Russia, he lived under house arrest for almost a decade. He was not trusted by the very people he had served for years. Guy Burgess and Donald McLean both died in exile in Russia. Anthony Blunt was stripped of his positions and his knighthood. He died 3 years later. John Cairncross was forced into exile on mainland Europe, but eventually, he was allowed to return to England before his death. He died in The Cambridge 5 scandal permanently shook British society. The revelations spread across decades exposed not only the extent of Soviet infiltration, but also the government's willingness to hide uncomfortable truths. The British public was left wondering how many lives had been sacrificed to protect the establishment's reputation.
Philby lived 30 years in Moscow. Alone, regretful, forgotten. 1970s. Moscow. Kim Philby was sitting in a small Soviet apartment. He was looking out the window. It was snowing. It was always snowing. He was 60 years old. His hair had turned white. His face was lined with wrinkles. He was alone. His wife had left him. His children didn't want to see him. The Soviet state gave him a small pension, but they didn't trust him. For years they had interrogated him. The KGB feared he might be a double agent. Maybe he was still working for the British. This was absurd, but the paranoia was real. Philby was isolated. Former KGB officers would sometimes visit him to listen to his stories. Young agents saw him as a legend, but most of the time he was alone. He would drink vodka. He would smoke. He would get lost in his memories. Sometimes he wondered if he regretted it, if he had made a different choice, if he had chosen a different path at Cambridge, if he had rejected Otto's offer. But no, he still believed. His faith in communism had not wavered. He still thought capitalism had collapsed. He was still sure the Soviets would win. But sometimes, in the dark of night, he felt something else. Guilt. He thought of Donald McLean. He thought of Guy Burgess. He thought of the young Georgians he had killed. The agents sacrificed to protect his secret. They had all died because of his choices. They had all suffered because of his lies. He closed his eyes. He fell asleep. And the nightmares came. The nightmares always came.
May 11, 1988, Kim Philby died. He was 76 years old. In his Moscow apartment, alone. His funeral was held with state ceremony. Soviet officials honored him as a hero. But in the West, his death reminded of something different. Betrayal, lies, loss, and a man who sacrificed everything for his ideals, even his soul.
Today, Kim Philby's story remains as a warning, not just about espionage, but also about ideology, about belief, and about the cost of completely dedicating yourself to an idea. Philby had been educated at one of the world's most elite universities. He had worked at the most prestigious institutions. He had earned the trust of the most powerful people, but in the end, he had lived inside a lie for 30 years, and that lie destroyed countless lives. British intelligence never fully recovered after the Philby scandal. Trust was permanently damaged. Recruitment processes were completely redesigned. Security protocols were tightened. But the damage was done. The darkest irony of Philby's story is this. Despite all his sacrifice, all his betrayal, all the pain, the Soviet Union collapsed. Communism fell. The system Philby believed in, the cause he dedicated his life to, failed. Just 3 years after his death, the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviets dissolved. One of history's greatest ideological experiments ended, and Philby had bet everything on the wrong side. But perhaps the most frightening lesson is this. The next Philby may already be among us, in another country, in another institution, with perfect cover, with a trustworthy face, and no one will suspect, because the most dangerous spies are those who never look like spies. And if you're wondering, the day Philby died in his Moscow apartment, a mysterious package arrived at MI6. What was inside? Nobody knows, because that file is still classified. It won't be opened until 28. Kim Philby is keeping secrets even after death.